Uh, okay, I think we can begin. I'm just monitoring the number of participants to see if there are still any who are joining us. Okay, maybe let me, because I see there's been an addition. Let me just wait until 5 past exactly. Oh, well, it's 5 past. So let us begin. Greetings all and welcome to today's history workshop webinar. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Bridget Kenny, who's going to present her paper titled "The Lift Girls Lament: White women lift operators and the affective urban space of elevators in mid-20th century Johannesburg." So Professor Bridget Kenny is a professor of sociology here at the University of Witwatersrand. She works on political subjectivity, gender, class, and race in service work, and precarious employment, historically and in the present day. Her books include Retail Worker Politics, Race and Consumption in South Africa, Shelved in the Service Economy, published by Palgrave Macmillan, 2018, and Walmart in the Global South, which she co-edited with Carolina Bank, Munoz, and Antonio Stretcher, 2018. So Prof. Kenny is going to have about 25 minutes to present and outline her argument or arguments. After that, we will then open the discussion to the rest of the floor, and we'll be taking a round of 3 questions per each round. And participants can make use of the hand raising feature, and then I will call out on them to speak, unmute and speak, or they can also make use of the chat section there, and I'll read the comments and the questions from the chat section so that we're all together. So again, I'd just like to remind everyone to keep their mics muted. And also another important reminder is that these sessions are recorded and they'll be uploaded in our History Workshop YouTube channel. So please subscribe and help us grow our page. So without wasting more time, over to you, Bridget.
Great, thanks Tabiso, and thanks to History Workshop for hosting me. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Is that visible? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Prof, it's visible.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna take you through a paper entitled "The Lift Girls Lament," after the Jeremy Taylor song, which I'll be talking about white women lift operators in the affective urban space of elevators in mid-20th century Johannesburg. This is a paper that I have, I think of it as the fragments of what are included in this paper have existed and I've been playing with in different form for, I don't know, probably the better part of a decade. So this is a kind of a new framing, and it came out of kind of rethinking the section on lift girls, which was actually the end of a paper that I've actually now published in Social History called "To Protect White Men on the Job Reservation of Lift Operator Jobs." And that section was chucked out by the proverbial reviewer too, and the editors, and I'm trying to think through how to make that part of the argument a bit stronger. So I'm really looking forward to comments today. So I'm going to try to go fairly quickly through the first part of the paper and then get to the more interesting second part of the paper on the actual lift girls. So my paper is directed then thinking through how white women lift operators is a site that we can think about for engaging with particularly new literature and new gathering of work on the white working class and white workers in South and Southern Africa. So I'm going to direct it a little bit towards that literature. And my argument is quite a strong argument for doing that through paying attention to the affective histories of both the space of lifts and the labor and relations that are happening in the lifts. So the first half of the paper is trying to establish that, in fact, lifts have an affective history. I open with this quite heady quotation from a South African columnist in 1952, in which she is talking about her failure to catch a lift. She says, "Sometimes I sink into a tangled heap on the floor in front of a lift, sobbing quietly into the crook of my arm. At other times, I beat a wild tattoo on a door, screaming, 'Open sesame, open sesame.' On rarer occasions, I have lost all control and I've rushed from lift to lift, wrenching at the handles and kicking and scratching like an orangutan in its first 5 minutes of captivity." This is a kind of heady, over-the-top, hyperbolic, but presumed common set of experiences. For her, this also involved an experience of this so-called lift girl. She continues, and she says, "On catching a lift on a higher floor, if I want to go down, they stop and tell me they're going up. In fact, they sometimes stop for no other reason than to jeer at me. 'Going up,' says a lift girl with ill-conceived mirth, and the other people in the lift start laughing themselves sick." So the idea is that this is we understand that resonates with us on some level, that it's difficult to catch a lift, that it's frustrating, and this idea, the idea that these spaces are then complex, intimate in some cases, and awkward spaces. They are, of course, particularly and specifically urban phenomenon, making living and working possible in cities. Rem Koolhaas notes, of course, that it's not only the steel frame that allows for skyscrapers, but it is, of course, also the technology of the lift. And so I'll go quite quickly through some kind of resonances of how the lift or lifts constitute urban space affectively. The first, of course, is quite simply the ways in which lifts represent progress, technology, and modernity. Here's an advertisement for the importation of 23 electric microdrive lifts for Johannesburg's new railway station in 1930. This included lots of, in our understanding of lifts, we have lots of commentary on that technology and the progress, the high-speed geared unit multi-voltage lifts of this comment on a new bank building in 1933 in Johannesburg. Also, of course, went along with the aesthetic qualities of these and the luxury of these lifts, the polished brown mahogany, etc. But over time, lifts were also, there was lots of commentary on the relationality inside the lifts. Here's a very quick quote that I won't read, for a letter to the editor in 1959, commenting on the health threats, and we might think of that today, of sneezing on the canvas covers. And of course, we see the figure of the so-called native attendant being quite critical to this kind of commentary in a typical sanitation syndrome kind of discourse. But this was also, of course, this particular comment was at the time when job reservation was being debated for passenger lift operator jobs. As I've said, I've written a piece which you can find in Social History, published in 2020, looking at the debate on job reservation. So the operator jobs for passenger lifts were reserved in Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein in 1960. It's a very interesting case because it was not prompted by a union or a worker as we typically think of job reservation, but the state was very interested in it because, of course, it meant that if they could employ white men in these low-wage jobs, in these low-skilled jobs, they would basically be accomplishing full employment. These were jobs that were repeatedly represented as being worked by white men who were elderly, infirm, disabled, alcoholic in some cases. The state, made a large, sort of a strong case for ensuring that they too could provide for their families. So that paper looks at not just how job reservation was a case for protecting whites, but specifically the white male breadwinner. But then what I look at as well is how that debate was very much more about what else was happening in the city. So job reservation wasn't just an instrumental argument about the state protecting whites and garnering their votes, but there was a whole lot of other things that we can see in that. And here's a quote, much edited, which shows some of the dimensions around which the debate was constituted. So first of all, the request for job reservation came from a husband who didn't want his wife riding up in a lift with a Black operator to her doctor's offices. Here we have debate occurring where it's the confidence of the so-called native operator that's offensive to this advocate. And we also have, of course, not just the job being contested, but in fact, it's about Black passengers who are riding the lifts. And that second quote continues on for quite a bit along the, sort of trying to protect white women's purity in the lifts as they ride next to Black passengers. So what we see is a lift is a kind of space which is being debated around all sorts of other dimensions. And job reservation is a kind of fulcrum to control the space by ensuring a white man is in that space. But what I do in this paper then is to think about my work on department stores, where I've done quite a lot of work, and my book was on retail spaces over much of the 20th century. And you can see these are two department stores, Anstey's and OK Bazaars in downtown Johannesburg. And you can see mostly that they are multi-storied. What we have then is, as the job is reserved for whites, in particular spaces like commerce, where white women were majority workers, white women continue to work as lift operators. And so then we have a kind of shift in this, from this intense language of the job reservation discussions and debate to what it meant to work there in these kinds of spaces for white women. Here we have a newspaper article from 1945 in which white women are both the consumers, the shoppers in downtown Johannesburg on the right, and as they crowd into a department store lift, and also the lift operators, and the woman in Black standing to the far left is the operator. So on one hand, there's this kind of sense that, well, the white women operators are kind of like the same as the consumers, and everybody, these are basically spaces for women to hang out in. There is, of course, some commentary on their labor. So this is from the same article where they talked about the girl pilots, and the sort of intensity of their work, taking 70 people up every 2 minutes, etc. I'm going to skip over some of the other ways in which I talk about the discourses around the lift girls and get to the main section of the paper that I want us to think about. I deal then with what it means to work as a lift operator, as a white working class woman in the mid 20th century. And I do this through a few fragments. The first fragment is this photograph by David Goldblatt called In a Department Store, probably John Orr's, on Van Brandes Street, Johannesburg, June 1965. I interviewed him about this photograph. He didn't actually remember taking it, but we had a great conversation about the broad set of questions. And what you can clearly see, as Goldblatt's work generally discussed, is the class difference that he's portraying. The way in which the lift operator women are standing on the side of the lifts in their uniforms, contained, a little bit bored, and the middle class women, older women, moving out of the lifts as they move on to their next purchase. So this was, again, a kind of commentary on something that, as much of the sort of new literature on white workers is trying to also foreground on a category that was not supposed to have a class differentiation, but in fact there was a class differentiation amongst white South Africans, and then sort of thinking through what that means. I then move on to a few interviews that I've conducted both with shop assistants for my earlier work, and then one lift girl herself. So Annalise Haynes worked as worked in Woolworths in the early 1960s on Saturday mornings while she attended school. She was initially hired as a shop assistant and then became a lift attendant. Annalise's mother was Afrikaans speaking and her father was English. Her father was absent often as an itinerant bricklayer, and her mother worked in garment factories around the city in the 1950s when she was growing up. Annalise was 17 when she began working as a lift girl. Like the other young women, she needed to work to earn her own pocket money. The job paid less than many women shop assistants earned, but seemed to accrue an informal status from the work. Johanna recalled that the lift girl performed for the customers and her co-workers with the routine calling out of floors. Moira, a shop assistant also in Woolworths, too remembered how her colleagues would belt out first floor ladies in assertive tone. She enacted the rapid pace of listing a floor's amenities. Unlike the shop assistants, the lift girls, quote, had quite a snazzy little uniform. They didn't have to wear black skirts like she did. I think they were red, black and red. The lift girls called out the floors for the customers and in their delivery delighted their co-workers, often riding between floors in the lifts as well. The affect circulating in the space for these women was often of light-hearted entertainment, a domain controlled by other women. The lift operator job held an allure that attached to the heady skill of driving a lift and being in charge of that space. Annalise became the quote unquote, the official Woolies lift girl and described her job. There were 5 floors. First floor was selling, where all the selling took place. There was no food like today. It was all clothes. Specifically, it was Marks and Spencer type of clothes. On the second floor, there were all sorts of different offices, but on the 5th floor was the canteen. And so I would take people up and down. For her and other Johannesburg residents, Woolworths held brand status as a subsidiary of the British store Marks and Spencer. Being able to buy, quote, this type of clothes in South Africa, indicated the sumptuary hierarchy of proximity to the metropole, or at least a kind of global sense of cosmopolitanism. And here I refer to John Hislop's work. Working in these spaces conferred a kind, for Annalise, the job also involved the skill of manipulating the technology of the lift, and like in Moira's demonstration, Annalise stood straight and projected her voice on each command. She would, quote, move the lever and say, exactly like the Jeremy Taylor song, first floor. She continued, I really enjoyed that. I had a chair, the lift was automatic, but there was a lever and I used the lever to close the door. The job of controlling the technology made her feel she had some skill, especially for white women at the time, where other options included clerical or sales work. She also found affinity, the affinity of her colleagues and customers appealing. I got to know the entire community. It was really fun. I don't remember ever having a problem with a lift. The biggest fun was to get someone else to take over and to go into the canteen, she said. I learned how to keep people busy if the lift got stuck. More than anything, a sense of purpose of the job rested in the skill of the service. And here we come to this quote where she says, but the most important thing is that I learned how to do that lever. And she describes how she would sort of put it into place. And then she would call, as we'll see with the Taylor song, you have to sort of use an authoritative voice, storeroom, 4th floor. And she said that voice, people would get into the lifts on lunch breaks and they would say, so Annalise, where are we going? And it was a joke. And she said, 3rd floor, Penty. Everyone knew everyone, she explained, and they were mostly not customers, but often they were other workers. So in her recounting, Annalise relished this time. The work involved this sort of an informal authority and competency. She controlled the space and she portrayed the space of lifts as one of camaraderie, including sneaking out and getting food in the canteen and joking with others. Her experiences suggest quite a different affective content than the annoyances of overcrowding and some of the earlier portraits, the humiliation, possibly of class status differences, and certainly not the sort of what was being debated in the job reservation discussions on racialized or sexualized conflict. Instead, working as a lift operator, while enabling her to earn a wage, also expanded her realm of engagement in this public space, made up mostly of other white women. Black women began to work in department stores as service workers only in the late 1960s, and Black men who worked as distributive workers did not take the lifts. White customers might be more wealthy, Annalise's story suggests, while white customers might be more wealthy, Annalise's story suggests that workers in the shop also made their own relationships. Thus, while class differences with other white women would have been apparent to the lift girls, as we see so starkly portrayed in Goldblatt's photograph, their jobs also opened up a kind of work that allowed for experiences of collectivity, play, and independence in the city. The respectability of these women workers was surveilled as part of the labor process. Like other shop assistants, Annalise reported to the older women supervisors who would keep watch over them and were very strict with monitoring their dress and working hours and registers. She said that she never saw the men, that is the managers, the women supervisors, looked after people. In hindsight, she felt that the older women were protecting and teaching them how to be respectable. She said, quote, they had an educative stance, and then she represented them as saying, we have to help these girls to grow up. She explained that she went on to do a teaching degree in an Afrikaans university through a government bursary as an example of the support that the National Party extended, especially to Afrikaners at the time, to cultivate buy-in. She says, I had to become a teacher because that was the only bursary you could get. She met many other women at university, but she said that despite the maternalism of her Woolies matron supervisor, quote, work was a big affirmation. It made me feel real strong. The job thing was different than university. It was not just preparing you for a man like university. There was something different being independent. So it rubbed off. This is still quoting her, because at university, I encountered so many privileged Afrikaner white girls, but they didn't have this thing that I did, unquote. Having worked as a lift operator offered her an intangible set of experiences, sedimented in the way she felt about the job, which also taught her about herself beyond a role as wife, mother, or caregiver. The discourses of the time around self-improvement and respectability also defined her work experiences, but those years exceeded the simpler discourse of gendered class upliftment and pointed to class differences among whites in ways that the service job enabled other meanings to inform her trajectory of mobility. So in some ways, I'm trying to ask questions such as, how did working class complicity work? How was national belonging or desire for belonging related to forms of not quite belonging, not only to exclusions? How might such forms have been reproduced through lack of a language for articulating experiences? Annalise speaks of generating her own sense of space regardless of class strictures and forms of discipline, which did not relate to state promises of protection as such for these women. Apartheid hegemony certainly sustained itself through the rationality of state protection, jobs and welfare for whites, and these white women benefited. Nevertheless, their experiences in the jobs also suggest other intimacies at stake in those realms where service work constituted symbolic spaces for white public engagement. And I move from here, so I'm going very quickly through all of this because of the time. I move from here then to my last fragment, which is Jeremy Taylor's song, written in 1960 called The Lift Girls Lament. He says that what he liked is, and he did this in the song, he imitated a white working class woman calling out the floors as she let passengers on and off in a grand Johannesburg department store. She was a lift girl ferrying customers up and down the lift all day. And just like the women that I interviewed commented on, his song went something like this, and I will not sing it. First floor, knitwear, beachwear, sportswear, equestrian, millinery, ladies' underwear. Thank you. We are the lift girls in a big department store. We kindly take the patrons going up from floor to floor. Don't wonder if we're weary of standing up all day, because when the doors fly open, it's our job to say, second floor. Ach, sis, toch, Marlene, what a hell of a job this is. The boss won't even give us time to go and have a ziz. And while we're on the job, we can't even have a smoke. Ach, I'm so tired, man, I'd give anything for a Coke. The lift girl's job was taxing. She continued up to the fourth floor. Hey, take your hands off me. Who do you think you are? I may do 1,000 feet a day. but I'm not going to go that far until finally she began her descent, going down. If only I had a minute or two to sit down on my feet. I'm going to sue this company for giving me flat feet. I've got fallen arches and lumbago in my back, and I suppose it won't be long now before I get the sack. So Taylor's using humor and to comment on the contradiction of these regal spaces, which relied on relatively grueling work conducted by white women. He loved the Johannesburg English accent, he explained to me, mixed as it was, refusing to be either pure Afrikaans or fluid English. There was flirting and touching in lifts, but this was something tedious to withstand, as was flat feet and backache. The service offered was the experience of direction and surety, which these straight-talking women provided. The song was written as the job reservation for lift operators went into effect. In the late 1960s, the National Party banned the Lift Girls Lament, and Taylor explained the song was banned for, quote, ridiculing a section of the population. The information, he said, was imparted to him by a rep of the SABC and who he went to see at the time. The Lift Girls Lament was certainly not a representation of respectable femininity. The white women's public presence both secured a culture of white service and reproduced class difference. That the National Party disapproved of the letter suggests how white belonging was so carefully prescribed, as many others have recently noted. And yet these wider fragments suggest that white working class structures of feeling exceeded such strictures and perhaps point to differences of mobility and lateral relationships, which also defined everyday white publics, not only with respect to the state. And I think that's partly what I'm trying to engage. I haven't had time to talk about it, but we can talk about it in discussion. Partly what I'm trying to engage with in relation to the sort of new literature on white workers and the white working class. The Lift Girls Lament, perhaps then, that is that white working class women's experiences have been overlooked, alerts us to the intricacies of such places of relationality and to the importance of attention to affect for extending debates about race and class. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for that very informative and historical piece. I really enjoyed, personally, I enjoyed particularly the first half of the paper when I was reading it, the history of the lift. And I was thinking how even the history is now shifting also because of the COVID pandemic, and how the spaces in the lift have always been uncomfortable. Now there's the COVID, and then people are told maybe to minimize the numbers in these lifts to maybe two people. So I also think that history continues. But then my question before, maybe I'll start, and then before I open it to everyone else, just allow myself as the chair to do this, is the question of, did these elevator operators, these young white women, did they have trade unions or representatives or that kind of organized labor to represent them, and what did it look like? Because it seems like these jobs were reserved for them. So was it contentious? What were the contestations like with management and with the people who reserved the jobs for them? Okay, so that's my question. And then, to the rest of the participants, so we'll take rounds of 3 questions. So each round will be 3 questions. So an individual can ask or can comment, can raise 3 questions or 3 comments, and that will be a round. And then we allow Prof. Kenny to respond to that. And I see we have our first hand, which is Prof. Noor. So Prof. Noor, yes, you can go ahead and comment or question.
Thanks very much, Thabiso, and thanks, Bridget, for a wonderful presentation. I have 2 or 3, I think, related questions. It's about the kind of relationships of these lift operators with various publics. And the first question is about the potential difference, if you think there are, between lift operators in the retail buildings, which seems to be the focus of your paper, and lift operators in other kinds of buildings, such as residential buildings. And I would imagine that the kind of affective dimensions that you focus on would, that there might be differences if women were employed as lift operators in residential buildings. So I suppose two questions there: were they in any significant numbers? And if so, do we have any sense of how they imagine themselves? And here I'm referring to all the questions about respectability, et cetera, if they were, operating lifts in residential buildings. And one would imagine that their relationship with people in those buildings would be quite different, from the ones that you analyze in the retail buildings. And then a second question, and then I'll stop. I've got a couple more, but I'll stop after that. It's kind of related to your kind of previous work on women in the retail sector. And the question is about both the hierarchy in kind of employment amongst white women in, for example, Woolworths or Oka Bazaars, between the different, departments. And where in that hierarchy would the female lift operators fit? And what was the relationship between them and women, for example, on the floor in different sections? And this, of course, relates to issues of kind of white working class identity and the layering of the white working class in a particular, spatial setting. Thanks. And if I have an opportunity, I'll ask a couple more questions. Thanks.
Okay. So that the two comments or the questions from Prof. Noor and my own, I think they'll comprise of this round, Prof. So you can you have the opportunity to respond to them now, and then I will take another round after you address those.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much for the questions. Yeah. Let me first deal with the lift operator job. So white women, I think, mostly did not work in residential buildings. Those were often either white men. And then what happens because of the job reservation is that, and because sort of across the board, nobody really wants to employ these white men. Not partly because sure, they make 3 times more than what black men would earn, but also, because they're unreliable, or at least as the debates went. And so what happens in buildings is they get replaced. I mean, lifts either get replaced, which is a dramatic thing to happen to actually replace a lift because it's very expensive. With automatic lifts, or you might have noticed that in fact the technology provided already for automatic lifts or for semi-automatic lifts that you could shift to. So quite a lot. So part of what I argue at various moments in other pieces is how the necessity for the service to a white public is important to understand some of these jobs. So lift operator jobs are seen as a service job to the white public specifically. And of course, a passenger lift is defined as that which carries, European white South Africans, where a goods lift is defined as carrying Africans or goods. So in general, I think residential buildings were serviced by men and women, and that's specifically why I was interested in these kind of funny, the way in which white women maintain these jobs in commerce. So I do think, Noor, that it's a particular affective space that is constituted, that is being constituted in stores. Part of what I'm interested in is then how these spaces are also affecting, urban downtown spaces, and that those are the experience of shops. So I think you're absolutely right that the affective dimensions would look very different if white women were attending to residential buildings. The fact that they are attending to a space that's already constituted through white women's labor, I think, is very important for to explain why they continue. But there, I think, it's very hard to find signs of these white women. They weren't only in commerce. They were, I think, in some office buildings as well. But that's just very hard to find. So, but in general, the residential buildings, I think, were being serviced by men. But what that leads a little bit to Bisa's question, which is about trade union membership. So operators, which is very interesting in the job reservation discussions, it's defined as a sector, of course, because that's, how the national legislation, what it expects. You have to kind of define a sector. But of course, if you stop and think about it, it's not a sector. There are lifts in all sorts of different sectors, industrial sectors, and so what it meant is this kind of, there's comment on this. It meant that there's this kind of agglomeration of different sectors having to think through their own needs, as with having a lift operator. And what that meant is that trade unions in general, well, at the time of the lift job reservation, there wasn't a trade union representing lift operators as such. So in commerce, which is what I'm presenting here, the lift operators were it's a job category that would be organized by the Commercial and Distributive Workers Union, the National Union of Distributive Workers. So I write about the NUDW quite extensively in my work on shop assistants. So they would be a kind of, a job that would be organized. And I think one of the things that you find, Nor, then to come back to your second question, is that within a shop, there's, well, first of all, there's a hierarchy, obviously, between shops. So Annalise's discussion is about Woolworths. I don't, clearly that kind of freedom to operate, to sort of, play around with her coworkers would not look the same as, as in John Orr's. So first of all, there are differences in the actual department stores. OK Bazaars looks very different from, John Orr's, and Woolworths is somewhere in the middle. But obviously having more, capacity for the women workers to feel like they control those spaces. But part of my argument is that you have a kind of this strange camaraderie that she describes, I think, because it's a closed space, right? Not because there's slightly less surveillance from the older matrons, and the sort of the floors are distinguished by commodities sold, of course, and the sort of relative status of the commodities, but commerce is also defined by experienced work. So you become a kind of experienced shop worker after 4 years of in a job. So there's a kind of there's a hierarchy between the women and the men. The women are paid a lesser rate than the men. And then there's a hierarchy within the jobs that relate to years of experience. And lift operator jobs were paid on a single, not experience. They weren't ranked, so they didn't sort of move up that job ranking, and they didn't accrue and carry their years of experience in the same way that the shop workers did. And so they were paid at I think, if I recall the wage determinations, they were paid at more than a year one entry of a shop assistant, but I think possibly at a level 2. So the wage level doesn't go up as far as a higher yeared shop assistant. But clearly there's something else that's accruing to these jobs. And what I think is, again, this is very hard to sort of track in what exists, but what I think is clear from at least what I'm presenting in this paper is that these are younger women. So there's also a kind of way in which the labor market shifts over time, where you have in the 30s and 40s young women moving into shop assistant jobs and moving up, and then moving out when they get married. And then by the 1950s and 60s, many of those women continue to remain in those jobs after they're married. So they're married women workers in the 50s and 60s who are working in shops. But I think that it seems, at least from what I have seen, is that often the lift operator jobs are kind of the younger women who may be getting those jobs initially, and likely because of the pay grade as well. So I think you're right. There is a kind of hierarchy. They are, I mean, I certainly know from my interviewing around shop assistant jobs that there was a hierarchy in terms of, you know, how they participated in the union, and how they understood that kind of hierarchy is very important for the facilitation of the kind of labor process on the shop floor, and then also, you know, how that related to the status. So I think that's right. I think that does account for differences even within that, you know, that workspace. And what I'm sort of interested in relating to this sort of new, or at least gathered new literature commenting on the white working class, particularly there's I think important edited volume by Duncan Money and Danielle Fenzel Herman, and each of their separate books. I think Duncan Money's book is about to come out, and then also an invited review article in the International Review of Social History in this year. The edited volume came out last year. You know, is that they make the important point that there's a kind of a homogenization of at least our understanding, and many people, I mean, Neil Russ's work, I think, is important on this point as well. You know, make the point that there's a kind of homogenization of a white working class, either after 1924, when they're incorporated in South Africa in the industrial relations system, or, you know, certainly after 1948, when the apartheid state comes in and gives lots of subsidies, etc. And there's we kind of homogenize that experience and kind of, you know, okay, you know, we've done away with a working class kind of white background. And, you know, there's lots of, you know, showing how that persists, and, you know, there's lovely work showing how, you know, sort of the white state, in fact, disciplines whiteness, how it doesn't completely work, and how, you know, there's gaps and things like that. But what I think is very interesting about much of that literature, and this is what I'm trying to sort of think through, and perhaps there's zero significance to what I'm trying to do, but that it's the relationship to the state, right? Is that we're concerned that how the white working class, which is our theory, which is part of our theory, right, is a subsidiary part of our theory of racial capitalism. That is that the white working class, you know, was incorporated by the state, and vice versa, that the state, you know, needed the white working class the National Party needed the white working class to vote for it, and, you know, and this is how it worked out, and also that it divided the working class, full stop. Those are the kinds of arguments that go back to the old, you know, debates about job reservation and function of job reservation as well. And you know, and that makes sense. That it makes sense that we'd be thinking through those class relations and politics in that way. But what I have noticed is even the newer literature is very much still concerned with that kind of instrumental relationship between now these sort of diversified class stratified, you know, sort of stratifying white workers, but still sort of thinking through how that related to the reproduction of racist power. And white women, at least shop workers, you know, we've talked, you know, there's lots of stuff on garment workers for the earlier period, but shop workers are slightly, you know, a category that doesn't quite fit that. They're clearly benefiting. I'm not arguing against that, but I think there's something interesting happening where, you know, and affect lets us get at that, where it's a, you know, there are these, in a sense, the way I think about it is there's not really a language for them to think through their experiences at work as workers. And what I always go back to is Carolyn Steedman's A Good Woman, where she thinks about her own working class mother who doesn't fit the kind of heroic, you know, narratives of working class history that she was reading when she was starting to become interested in doing history. So and it may not matter. I mean, I may be kind of getting myself into knots over what this kind of looser less directed history of how these women engage each other around class identity. Although I think I'm also making an argument for how workers' politics can also be described through these kind of affective relations, which also constitute spaces like shops and downtown Johannesburg streets in ways that we haven't examined so directly. That was a very long answer to that. But yeah, but I mean, I think we can keep going with that, but let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for your responses. And Prof, no, you can always come back with the other two questions. But for now, there's two questions in the comment, the chat section, which I will read out. So it's from Kasonde and Julie. So I'll start with Kasonde's, which reads, I'm wondering what attitude white women lift operators had with global feminism, especially considering their class position. While you read Taylor's last stanza, exhaustion with flirting, etc., could it be a comment on sexual harassment? And then in brackets, I might be making a historical comment. Me too is recent, but curious about your thoughts. And then the second one from Julie reads, I was thinking also of intimacy versus surveillance. Were the women discouraged from eye contact, trained in comportment? How did their work status transfer to the domestic space, if at all? So, Prof, I'm going to ask you to be quick in responding to these two comments and questions. And then the next round, I will take Ariana and Krishana's views. So for now, this will be the round, these two. So I'm going to ask you to be quick so that we allow for the next round. Okay.
Okay. I think that's a great, those are both great questions. To Kasonde, I think absolutely. I think partly the Taylor song is slightly hinting on that because he's trying to do it humorously. He's trying to kind of use humor and hint at a kind of darker, a darker set of relations that he's pointing to. Certainly. So I'm going to have to go through the interviews that I've done. And there's only one actual lift girl that I interviewed. Some of the other interviews are people who were shop assistants who talked about the lift girl. But certainly in broader interview, I mean, I've been now trying to find and interview white women shop assistants who worked between the 30s and the 70s, and some of them are now obviously passed away. I think sexual harassment was an ongoing, regular threat, which was very hard to talk about. In other words, it surfaced with white women, not as an overt discussion, often as shame. And this is kind of what I mean about Steedman. Some of this stuff gets put, and some of what might consolidate in a certain articulated form, if there was language for it, actually gets pushed into other directions like shame. So the women that I interviewed were not, they were reading women's magazines. They were, having discussions, around, those kinds of issues in the 1960s, but they weren't, they wouldn't have called themselves feminists. I don't think, that at least that's how they spoke to me about it. But those were questions there. Now, interestingly, part of why I'm interested in looking at white women is to look at least in my book, is to look at what the context was like when Black women entered those service jobs. And in that transition, there are a number of cases that I found in union records where, Black women are subjected to sexual harassment, which I think probably also bears on the earlier period, and then contested in different ways and in different collective ways, which is very important to me understanding Black women's politics in the later period. So I think that's a really good question. I think some of it's hidden, and I think that's again, that's that kind of thing of where are the silences and why are there silences there, and I think that speaks to partly the languages available and the potential for solidarity. It leads a little bit to Julie's question on how work status transfers to domestic space. I mean, a lot of the women that I spoke to I guess, sort of contested their domestic space in a way. In other words, even the very fact that they were earning a wage was a contestation. And sometimes I talked about, having, in their terms, useless husbands or alcoholic husbands or husbands that would go off and they had to keep going and they had to keep, working for their children. I think one person spoke about having a husband who sort of supported her in working and that and understood her economic contribution as kind of assisting their household. But there was a contradiction between that kind of stat. And I think what Annaliese's narrative shows is that it's early, she's young, she's very young, and she has this kind of, space to, to kind of figure out who she is. But when she gets into the kind of route, when she's now thinking of, when she gets in, into the bursary to train to be a teacher, then we get serious about what those gendered roles are. So I think there is this kind of gap between what they are enabled or allowed to do, but the surveillance, but I have a lot more on the kind of surveillance and control and disciplining of the white women, particularly by the experienced shop worker, sort of older matron women in the book, to explain, how that's, how that's controlled. I could say more, but Tabisa's here. Sorry.
Okay, Prof. Hopefully the discussion can go on if there's more time after this round of questions. So I'm going to start with Ariana. So Ariana and then Prishani. Then Prof, you'll get an opportunity to respond to those two after they've raised the comments and the questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Bridget. I'm sure you must have got these comments probably a million times, but every time I hear you speaking of this work, I can't help but think about the simultaneous movement of Black working class men going underground into the mines. I just wanted to ask if you thought about the two movements in relation to each other, and what the space of the mine shaft might do to the argument of the lift as an affective space, or how it might turn it around. So that's one question. And then related to the arguments you're trying to make around the heterogeneous nature of the white working class at this time. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but does the white lift girls tend to be Afrikaans speaking? And that seems, a kind of hint of that comes from the song. And I wonder if, in fact, what irked the National Party was not just the representation of white women as working class, but white Afrikaner women as working class. Thanks.
Prishani, Prof. Prishani, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Bridget, for the presentation. And this particular question has come to me because of how certain lines have come together in this particular discussion around questions of affect, self-affirmation through work, and possibilities for political organizing through work, and your previous work around the idea of the abasebenzi. And so I was wondering if you have found any collective forms of organizing or coming together amongst this particular category of women outside of the trade union in this moment. And that might, I think, open up other ways of thinking about their own idea of a politics and a political subject, or possibilities for politics differently. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so Prof. Bridget, yes, you can go ahead and respond to this. Hopefully, because our session is going to end I want our session to end before 2:15. So hopefully they take us, your responses take us to around that time. If not, then maybe we can squeeze in, if there's still any more questions and comments, we can still squeeze in those, but hopefully these two will take us to the end of our session. So yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start with Ariana's comments. Yes, so this bit, obviously comes out of my work on department stores, but it's part of a bigger project where I'm trying to look at lifts as kind of urban affective infrastructure, and broadly think through the labor, both the space and also the labor involved in maintaining that infrastructure then. So both not only lift operation, but also looking at, installation, repair, maintenance. And as part of that, some of you may have seen something I presented at in this place. I can never remember, Ariana, the name of that conference, anyway, earlier in the year, and with Simon Gush, who's a photographer and an artist, and we're going to do an exhibition at the Stevenson, which is going to be at the Stevenson next year in Cape Town, thinking through the lift repair and maintenance, specifically, and thinking visually as well. So I am thinking I am trying to think of the lift and its multiple kind of configurations in and around Johannesburg. And so obviously the mine cage is an exact sort of complementary alternative movement, as you say. So there's a couple of things that this is ongoing research, but a couple of things. First of all, the key thing that makes a passenger lift possible is not the capacity to raise up a lift, but it's to safely stop a lift from falling. That key piece of technology is a safety device invented by Elijah Graves Otis in, I think, 1856 or somewhere around there. The safety of lifts is passenger lifts is very critical. Early photographs of mine cage lifts don't have a similar safety. They have giant cables connected to the top of the cage, and that's what moves it down. Not these kinds of, these are sort of multiple technologies which wind down and under the lift, and there's these sort of multiple points of safety catches along the way. There's at least 3 different levels of safety for passenger lift, which I think can pretty much directly be related to an understanding of those workforces and what's happening. So I think that contrast is very productive. Also, the technology, of course, the technology for the lifts, for passenger lifts, are imported, which I'm very interested in. And the technology for mining cables and the cage, are locally produced as part of the engineering industry that builds off of the mining sector. And then, of course, those affective spaces I think are very important. I mean, I certainly, what comes to mind is Asanda Benya's research. She's in sociology at UCT, my former PhD student, and she wrote about women mine workers working underground. And one of the sort of deep, experiences is that sort of transition spatial moment of riding the cage and what it meant for, the very few women who were in the cage. The cages are still dark and they're crowded and people are pressed in standing. And the women have a kind of way of, okay, you get to the far end, you get to the side, you try to, but people, there's all sorts of sexual harassment that's happening. Well, that's the euphemistic way of talking about it, that is happening as those cages go down. So I think that contrast is absolutely critical to thinking through the spatiality of lifts and how that works to constitute urban space. So thanks, Ariana. The lift girls are not necessarily only Afrikaans. I mean, the woman I speak about has, Afrikaans mother and English father, but grew up, sort of in between. Earlier in the 1940s, they speak of Myrtle Brett, as a lift operator. So I suspect that the lift girls later on are more likely to be, Afrikaner women. And I think you're probably absolutely right that NP. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's something I'd have to check out a little bit more closely, but I will. So thanks for that. And Prashani, I mean, I think that's partly one of the questions that I have, right? Is that on some level, there's a sense that somehow work is doing something in a class configuration that affirms something that's not quite a generic working, like, or generic white identity, but there's no real place for that to go for these women, particularly by the 1960s. I mean, I obviously in the interviews that I did, I've asked, everybody, what are they doing outside of work, and what are their lives like? And they're not really relating, well, at least again, these are a handful of interviews over 20 years. They're not really talking about how they are hanging out with their other co-workers outside of work. They, obviously have, alternative, social groups, churches, family, in the way that we sort of understand, sort of civil society more broadly. But what I didn't pick up was those kinds of, which was sort of what I was looking for. And I think that's really important, because part of what I'm trying to get at is what are the potentialities for thinking through collective forms of political subjectivity that don't have a language for them? Where do those come out of? Do they get channeled into other dimensions, shame, resentment, racism, for that matter? How does that carry forward then into how we can understand racialized, highly racialized, politics that we see today? Is there a connection? How can we think through those questions? But again, it could be that, there's not that many. I haven't spoken to enough people.
Okay, thank you for that, for the responses to that round of questions, Prof. Kenny. I mean, as you might see, I have Ariana behind me now. We just had load shedding in the building, so well.
That's why I disappeared. Sorry, but Tabisa's laptop is still working. So. And
at least we are going to have the benefit of the recordings on YouTube. So hopefully those are not affected, and we can always go and catch the rest of the responses, the remainder of the responses there.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for those who are left, and thanks for everybody who came. Thanks very much.
Okay. So I just want to alert you, Prof. Lastly, too, there's a comment by Julie. Okay. So which said, so men lifts or elevators are enabling for people with disabilities or the elderly in ways that escalators or steps are not. Parents with children in prams, etc. too. So I think that was a parting comment, and then they are no longer online. So, but I think it's a very interesting observation, because I think if there were still many of them which are manned by people now, they'll be assisting people in this category, people with disabilities, children in prams, etc. So.
Yeah, great. That's a great comment. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And it's such a shame that our session was interrupted by this load shedding from ESCOM. But we can always catch the recording on our YouTube page, History Workshop, and we can always revisit the discussion there. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, Prof. And,
great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.